Give me a minute and let's talk about Bob's question here. Peter, can you shed some light on Russian grain going through Poland, or have I just seen a propaganda post? Yes, and yes. The grain situation and the farmers' protests across Europe are an extremely complex question. And I'll try to put it into some context here. If you take a look at this map behind me here, right? These are all countries that have been affected by farmers' protests. Now, and this map is from Politico, so you can see the map and the full article and all of their detailed analysis at the Politico website. And what this highlights is that across the boards, there's a problem in Europe right now. And that problem varies from country to country. In France, for example, the one thing that's consistent across the boards is that second point, low crop prices. There is a glut. The other big thing is perceived competition from Ukraine. And that's inflaming the situation across the boards. Diesel subsidies, the price of diesel is a problem. And we see that in France, in Italy, in Belgium. And then another thing that happens in the EU countries is this requirement to leave 4% of land fallow. So there's ecological reasons for doing this. And unfortunately, it affects farmers' pockets, right? It's 4% income that they're not receiving if they got to leave it unplanted every year. Now, the big thing, of course, is Poland, because they're right on the border with Ukraine. And Ukrainian imports are a problem. Traditionally, much of the grain grown in Ukraine was banned from import into Europe because the Ukrainians, for purposes of scale, economies of scale, and because it's a much poorer country than most of the EU, they use pesticides that are banned in Europe. And so Ukrainian grain has never traditionally been bound for a European market. But when Putin was threatening the blockade and threatening to blow up ships and burning hundreds of tons of grain a day down in Odessa, the EU eased those sanctions, eased permit restrictions for drivers delivering in Europe, and there was suddenly a glut of grain on the European market and other goods too. And that became a problem for the farmers, whose situation was already exacerbated by competition from big agribusiness, reductions in subsidies, the cost of diesel increasing, also partly because of the war, etc. And then, of course, the EU requirements to leave land fallow, and nature restoration rules and other ecological considerations. So this was a brewing crisis. Now, here's the thing. Who loves a brewing crisis in the West more than the Kremlin? Now, I can't say with certainty that all of this is Kremlin-backed. There is certainly a legitimate concern on the part of European farmers. However, that glut of grain is cutting into Putin's profits. No two ways about it. If they've got to compete on the European market for Russian grain, which is apparently coming into Poland through the Belarusian border by the metric ton, then that's more money out of their pockets, and they're already suffering in Russia. So it appears the evidence is mounting that these farmers, their legitimate concerns, because this is what Russia does, it takes a legitimate societal concern, and then it uses it as a leverage point, amplifies it until you have chaos. And it appears that the farmers are being used by the Kremlin for this purpose. Again, the data is not conclusive, but increasingly we have evidence that that is the case. And unwittingly, right? They have legitimate concerns. It's just that it's being ramped up and amplified by Russia for their own ends, to keep the price of grain up, to keep Russian grain flowing into Poland, to these kinds of things, right? So it's a real problem with no easy solution. And lots of families that have been farming for generations are suffering. We see the same thing in the United States. In fact, we saw very similar protests from farmers in the United States as well as truckers in the United States and in Canada that appear to, there the evidence is very clear that while not funded necessarily by Russia, they were fueled by Russian disinformation. And so this is what Russia wants. It wants the West fighting with itself. It takes advantage of our better angels, our freedom of speech, our right of assembly, all the time to inflame tensions in the United States and in Europe and turn us against each other. And take a legitimate concern that should have a political solution and instead turn it into internecine warfare. And that is the last thing that we need right now. So I'm deeply sympathetic to the farmers. I'm saddened that increasingly they are carrying, especially in Poland and Slovakia and Hungary, carrying pro-Putin, pro-Russian banners. This is not Brussels. This is Poland. God save Putin. I mean, these are real banners that these guys are carrying now as part of their protests. The Polish government is increasingly concerned about it. In Hungary, of course, the current government is in favor of it. And in Slovakia, Fico is on the fence, sort of. He's not commented on it at all. But there is an increasing pro-Russian feel to all of these things. And I don't think that's any accident. So, Bob, it's a complicated situation with real roots that I believe is being exacerbated by the enemy. Thanks, pal.